Who came here to see PowerPoint? Not me. Okay, sorry, I have an MBA, so I got to start with this. So, my name's Tony. I'm with SmartBear. Created this thing called Swagger. I'm going to talk to you about the API lifecycle and how API definitions, specifically this one, fits into it. I'm going to show you 3 different tools for generating servers and clients based on Swagger, and I'm going to hopefully convince you that this is a better way to write services. Right? So I have to give a tiny bit of background, and then I will turn off PowerPoint for good, I promise. So just so people have a little bit of background on what Swagger is, it is a simple, that's an important word, structured way to define APIs. It is based originally on JSON. It is extensions for YAML, so it's interchangeable. You describe methods, resources, parameters, all the stuff that you need to know how to both consume, an important word, produce your API, right? So people who are as old as me, and there's probably none in here.
Got your beat.
We'll talk later. Might have seen these types of things before. Code generation, Whistle to Java, Waddle to Java, OData. Nothing for assembly, Jennifer. So we've seen these before. They tend to suck. Like for example, this one was for Waddle. If I search GitHub for Waddle, there are 168 repositories on Waddle on GitHub for Waddle from a format that's been around since 2004. I would say where are all the projects? And this is why they're not that good. The spec itself is too complicated. It's hard to customize them, so when you generate code from a lot of the projects that are out there for these older technologies, it just makes really ugly code and people don't want to use it. So Swagger uses something called Mustache. Mustache is a web developed template or templating language for doing variable substitution. It's quote simple. It gets a little ugly sometimes, but not nearly as ugly as what you get from Waddle to Java. Right? So when you make this kind of definition, I'm close to being done with the PowerPoint, I promise. You start with something that looks like this. This is the Swagger editor. I describe the API, right? Notice I'm not writing code for it first. I'm actually starting with a definition, saying this is what I want it to do. I can click a button and download a client, in this case Objective-C. In this case, I can download a server, and this is Java. And now I have, my teams are happy. The butterflies and the bumblebee got married. And you've got the server guy can go off and implement his server. The client guy can go implement his client, right? So the workflows, that's really good, right? Instead of a whole bunch of code to prove something and then having to hand document it and then worse, having to read it. We started with something that's very concise and simple to read, human readable in YAML, and click 2 buttons, and we have servers in 10 different languages or frameworks, and then clients in like 21 or something like that. So that's good. But we're here to talk about workflow, and the workflow for this is great for Hello World. It stinks for real life. If I'm a consumer, right, and my client SDK I download, we're used to, like Objective-C developers used to downloading a new client, right? So Facebook comes out with some new APIs, they upgrade to 3.0.5, you download it, something breaks, you fix the builds, and everything's fine. The problem though is for the server is that what do you download and what do you do with it? So you can, for example, download a new server and copy files over because you added a method or a parameter or something that broke your old signature. You can use some things like we have a Maven plugin, so you can run generation in place. And it has to kind of be smart and say, hey, if this file exists, leave it because you changed something. You can overwrite this one. But it really is awful, right? Because once your project gets big, you're going to make changes. You're not going to want to regenerate and blow over everything, right? And so that's what I want to talk through and demonstrate today. The last thing is if you think about dry and not repeating yourself, right? You can't say Java without saying don't repeat yourself because it's just part of it. But in here, like I've got in my spec, I've got text, I've got descriptions, I've got stuff that tells the server the consumer what to do. And when I generate the server, then it puts it here again, right? And so then the developer's like, oh, I need to fix this typo, you spelled pet wrong. And then what do they update? They update that, or they update that. It's just confusing, right? So it's the same thing here. The idea is that if you use the Swagger specification in a modern framework for connecting with the backend, then it is actually easier to maintain a spec than it is to code. Okay, I'm going to stop with the PowerPoint. Any questions before I start on this? And I have to put this down because I'm talented, but I cannot type one-handed. Okay, so what I'm going to do first is hold up. I'm going to mirror so you can see. What we're going to do in this workshop is create an API, and then we're going to use 3 different frameworks to implement it, right? And that's a lot, but I'm sure that it can get done. Okay, so the first thing in here, I'm using this online tool. I'm using this online tool called Swagger Editor. You can go get the source for this. It's all open source. It's on GitHub under the Swagger API group. And what it is a mechanism to define your API. Right? It automatically updates here. I can add other information in here, such as I can say, when I make this call, I'm going to get an array of people. I'm going to describe it here in line. In this case here, there's a title and a description, right? So the purpose of this tool is to help you to write and define the API, right? We don't want a people API, right? Because that's boring. So let's start with something new. First, I'll give it a version, and it tells me first that that I'm a bad person and I'm missing all kinds of stuff. So let's start putting some real things in here. So we will make a drinks API. And we'll add a couple of paths here. So first off, a path represents a resource that I'm going to connect to. In here I'll say ingredients. And when I make this path, I need to tell it a couple of things. So for example, what method am I going to be calling, right? In this case, I'm going to make a get method. And the get method may or may not take parameters, right? So I can tell it what those parameters are. I'll say here that it's going to take a parameter whose name is called skip, right? So this is going to return many ingredients from my drinks API. It is a query parameter. It is required false, let's say, because it defaults to 0. Right? And what kind of type is it? I need to tell it. The whole idea of this description format is to say, I want to say that I expect a string or an int or a date time or whatever it is. So Swagger is pretty descriptive and requires you to put data types. So I'm going to say as a type integer and format int 32. Okay? So this is one parameter. I can add many parameters in here, but I'm not going to do that to you. And when I call this operation, it's going to return something. And the responses here will tell me what I'm going to get if I return, for example, 200. And why don't I say 200 description, great job. Right? And the red went away, so it says that there's no errors, so I'm happy now. The red makes me anxious. And I'm going to be returning an array of ingredients. So there's a schema. Type array. And inside that array there are things, right? Ingredients. And I can define the ingredient in line here. I'm going to reuse this over and over, so I'm going to put a reference. And this is using something called JSON schema pointers. Okay. Now there's no ingredients, so let me define the ingredients so that red will go away. This is the one time I wish that my heritage made me red-green colorblind. Definitions, ingredient. There are properties on this ingredient, like a name. Oops. has units type string, and we don't want to just be anything, right? I want to tell the consumer what the actual allowable values are for this. So I'm going to say it's milliliters or pieces or milligrams, right? So in here now I have a warning here. What does it say about that? Definitions.
A hash in front of the definition.
Did I miss something? Whoops.
There's a hash in front of the definition.
Thank you. Okay. So, cool. So now I have an array coming back. I can look at it in here, what it's going to look like. It's, I can do a little better job here. There's some fields are required. Name is required. And maybe I'll put a description down there. Oops. Okay. I didn't put a value for the ingredient, did I? Oh, forget it, doesn't matter. Okay. So now I can go through and define all of these different endpoints inside of here, where I put in the parameters that go in. For example, maybe I need to put I'll put a limit here. So how many values do I want to get back? Maybe this is defaults to 10, right? And if I had a server running, if I only had a server, it should be a song. Then I can try it out, right? Okay, so this is good. I can do what I showed you in the PowerPoint before. I can generate a server, and if I did it right, which who knows? Make sure I don't have a server running. I have a server running. Stop. Cool, so from this alone, I now have a server up and running that I can call, right? And I can see here that, let's talk about, we're back at workflow, right? Let's look at what it looks like now to make this happen. Here's my server that I just created. And it is my job to fill out all of these methods, right? And again, the thing that I just described, I'm showing you what I don't think is a good model, which is I made a definition, I did kind of this one-shot code generation, and now if I change something, it's going to blow over it, and I need to figure out how to merge those changes in, right? That alone, this is a lot of work that's just been done for us, right? So I can now literally run the server. If I call, what was that method called? Ingredients get. I should get a 500. Oh no, I said magic. So I'm not really doing anything here. I'm just returning this object here. Right? So my job is just now to fill in the business logic inside this and move along. Okay. However, we're gonna show you something that is more interesting than this here, and that is using 3 different tools. Okay. So let me show you the first one. This is for Java. It's something called Swagger Inflector. The whole idea here is that instead of doing code generation, that we're going to use a library that is simply going to read the location of my Swagger definition, and it's going to find a way to route methods, calls to methods, right? So if I have a call that goes from, I'll go back to my code. I have a call that comes in here, in my generated code. It is delegating this logic here to some function, right? Well, this is all a bunch of crap, right? I don't need to just redefine this over and over. So let's let a library take care of the routing, and we'll send the request directly to the controller that's going to do the work. So that's what this thing does. There's a quick start here. I'll give you a real quick demo before I show you with this project. right? No one ever reads the definition, the README. They just say, what's the QuickStart? So let me steal that. And what it's going to do is pull down enough information here to start the project. I'm on a slow connection. Right? And it tells me what to do here. It says you can open an editor here, which I will do. And part of this project, so it brings out an editor. You can see it's running localhost. One of the things that's different between this editor and the one I showed you before is that it is running the file system, right? So when I make changes, you can see it picks it up in here. And so I have this live saved file here, okay? So that's interesting. But what's more interesting here, it says you can start a server like this, maybe in package run. Whoops, that's not very. And first, if I show you the source code, there is not a single Java file in here. Okay. But because I know everything about how to connect to it, this is going to send a bunch of, it's going to wire the request in with, and it's going to look for a controller somewhere in my code, which doesn't exist. And it's going to say, oh crap, there's no controller here, and so let's send a mock response, right? So in this here, the framework is taking care of everything from receiving, registering the route, receiving the data, and then saying this is what I'm expecting to produce, which is some kind of object that looks like a person. And if it doesn't find it, it's going to return some mock data. So let's do this example, because string is not a good name. Tony, Tam, that's me, right? So you saw my server was restarting. It actually detected the change in the definition, and now instead of returning string, it's returning Tony Tam, right? So that's cool. The next thing is you can say, well, how do I make something like this real, right? I need to actually implement some functions. I need to do something. And if this project is so smart, right, it serves up this and it knows how to mock. It also knows what's not implemented, right? So it tells me here that there's a bunch of stuff I've got to do before this project is actually doing any real work. It's missing a controller. It's telling it where it's looking. It's looking for something called PeopleGet, which is a terrible name for a function. So let me rename that. Right? It's telling me that this doesn't exist, and I need to implement it. Right? So get people, that looks better. Right? So now what I can do is implement that one controller, and it will receive the request. It's looking for integer size as an input. I could add any other input in here, right? So I could add limit. Let me write all this, okay? And it's going to say, I need to find this function, right? So size and limit, right? Better terms here. So this is not necessarily the best API design, okay? Now this is one project. I'm going to show you two others, and then we're going to take that Drinks API concept and then turn that into running servers that you guys can actually launch and do all this on your own. Okay, so the next project here is called Swagger Node. And this is essentially the same thing but for Node. And it works a little differently because life would be boring if everything worked the same. There's a command line tool that you can install with npm called Swagger, and then you run just a couple of different things. Install Swagger, create a project, Swagger project edit, brings up this editor, and then again, your job is the same thing, is to implement the controllers, right? So I implement this business logic, and it's going to find it based on where I tell it to where to look. And if it exists, it'll execute it. If it doesn't, it'll return mock data, right? So a really powerful way to get around building boilerplate. And I'm lazy, and I don't like writing the same thing over and over, and this helps do that. The last project is called Connection. Right? And this is a Python Flask implementation of the same thing. These are all written independently, almost concurrently. The idea here is that you import one project, you tell it where to look for the Swagger definition and what it's called, and then it will do the rest, right? That makes sense so far? The general concept is let the framework take the definition, do all the hard work for the routing, you add the value from the business logic point of view, right?
Oh,
Yes?
what happens when you actually implement a controller and the controller returns something that doesn't meet the spec? Does the framework take care of?
Good question. The question is, if I lie and I say I'm going to get people, I'm going to return drinks instead, what's going to happen, right? So that depends on the framework. So the Swagger node one actually is pretty smart because we have a schema for the payload. We just use a schema. We say, look, this doesn't match the schema. You know, you're a bad person. You're sending a drink instead of a person, and you're going to blow up the client, right? The Java version that's not pushed, it will be shortly, and I'm not sure the state on this Python one. I also want to mention that these three projects were implemented by 3 different companies. So SmartBear behind Swagger wrote the Java version. Zalando in Germany wrote the Python version, and then Apogee in San Jose wrote the Node version. But they all have the same concept. Okay, so that's the general idea. Let's go and look at the definition here. Now, to spare you all from a bunch of typing from me, I took the liberty of typing in a little bit more so you don't have to watch. The idea here is that I made an API with a little more information in it. In here, there's I gave some information about what controller is going to implement it. I put some descriptions. We'll walk through it. This is an API to get ingredients used to make drinks. It takes a skip and a limit so I can page. Defaults to 5 values. And it returns an array. This is wrong. Which has ingredients inside it. There's another API which is a get method for drinks. And the idea is it gets popular drinks from the bar. I can give it a search string that is required. It's as a query parameter. I can tell it how many ingredients. It doesn't make sense. I'll say this instead. Limit. This will be description. So this is why you need a writer. You need somebody who can actually describe things here. Description. Number of drinks to return. And it's going to return a different structure of data here. It's going to return a single object, which is a drink response. So when you're modeling inputs and outputs, there's lots of techniques. A common technique you see people use is there's a wrapper object that returns some metadata and then it has some values inside it. And I decided in this case, I'm going to do that here. There's a drink response, and a drink response has properties which include a count. So I could say the total number, description, total number of records, because I might not have returned them all. And then it's going to return an array of drinks that inside it. So this is a payload with metadata on top of it, so a wrapper object, right? And then, most importantly, a mechanism to order a drink. In this case here, I've got a drink ID, and I'm going to give it a friendly function name called order drink. And we're going to see how that looks once we are in a Python world. We don't do camel case, right? We do underscores. So I'll show you how Swagger helps with that. It says it's going to take a drink ID, and the format for that, because we're very strict about drinks, is it's a UUID, so unique identifiers. And it is going to not return the value. It's going to return a 201. So I know, as a consumer, I know I'm going to order a drink, and it's going to take care of if I get a 400, it's an invalid user. If it's a 404, it's a drink that doesn't exist. If it's a 201, it means it's on the way, right? So you can describe all this stuff, and it's very important to do so when you have somebody consuming your API so that they know if they should wait around for look for a response or something like that. Okay? In here, you saw that there's a payload of a user that's getting sent. And that user has a couple of fields. There's a user ID, which is a string, a name, and I'm saying is required, you must have a user ID. So also as a consumer, you could always say that there's an ID if I get a user object back. Make sense? Okay, so there's my definition, and I said that this is interactive, so I want to give you guys the ability to try this out. So I'm going to go to Swagger Hub, which is one of our products, and I'm going to share this definition. This is not a pitch about Swagger Hub, this is a pitch about API First Design. Okay. So I'm going to save this definition, and now, if everyone who wants to try this out, can you read that and go to this URL here? Right. So this is anonymous, this has open access, so if you go to this URL, I don't know if it'll work on your iPad, but let's see. Okay. Let me leave this here. Look at that. Okay. So now, now I've got my definition. I can look at it here. This is the same code that you saw from the Swagger editor that's online. The reason why I put this in here is so that you can just go and get this definition directly from here. You don't have to type it. And let's see how it works. Okay, so let's start at the top, Python Flask. Okay, so it just generated a Python server using Flask. And if I unpack it, here it is. And let me go into that directory. What's all this junk? Okay. Now, if I look inside here, there's a couple different things. There's a README that's probably not very well written. There's a Swagger folder. And then there's a YAML inside of it. Okay? So if I look at this Swagger YAML, this is just what you saw up here before in the Swagger Hub. It brought it into the project, and I can launch the server by running Python 3. Okay. That's up. What it just did is read that definition and looked for controllers. I'll show you the code in a second. UI. There it is. Okay, so there's my server right here. And I can make calls against it. And it'll probably give me an error because I haven't done anything. Right? And it's saying here, do some magic. So let's see. Where is that happening in the code, right? If I look inside the project, this is what I downloaded. Here's my controller. It is calling get drinks. Notice the format, right? It's underscore instead of camel case, so that's Python-ish. And I can return whatever I want here. So all I have to do at this point is implement this one function here and return a drink in this case. Now, this is a lie right now. I'm just returning a string. And so back to Daryl, right? Lucky guess. The Daryl's point, it's not validating the payload coming back, right? It's just going to take the results. But now I've made some pretty big leaps here where there's literally no routing that has to happen, right? And if I make a change to this thing and I get rid of this limit, right? And I restart my server. Right? Let's get drinks. it's going to find the method, and it's going to do whatever I tell it when I execute, right? Okay? So that's a big deal, right? I just took away like a mountain of boilerplate code, and it's using Python, and it's using a popular routing framework, and it's using, you know, it works with Tornado and other things that I don't know very well because I'm just not a great Python person. But in any case, now what I do is I put this in source control, right? And this is the source of truth for my definition. And my QA person can look at this, right? They can look at this and say, this is how I need to call it. My technical writer can go in and fix these definitions without worrying about breaking things. And me as a developer, I can incrementally implement these methods, meaning I don't need to wait till the whole thing's done before it runs. I've got boilerplate in here, and it will just simply return something so that people can develop concurrently in parallel. Any questions on the Python piece here? I think it's cool. Are there any Python developers in here? Is that cool? I think it's cool. Okay. Let me now drop into, so try that out. I would actually love to get more feedback on it. Let me now drop into Node. And I'm going to go back to Swagger Hub here. And I have many Swagger Hubs. Okay. And so, now, the nice thing here is that because I'm working from a definition, let me clear out this folder, just a bunch of junk in there. Because I'm working from the definition, I haven't even committed to a language yet, right, or a framework for that matter. So, you know, we don't start the process of saying, okay, how hard is this going to be to implement? It's more like, what is the right way to describe the API, and what is the right structure to put in place, and then let's implement it. And this encourages, in fact, it forces you to do that instead of writing a bunch of code first, right? So if I go to Node.js, npm apply, let's look at what we have in here. This server has, surprisingly, same thing, Swagger definition, set of controllers that are in here, and then a service class that I can go and implement, and it's telling me what to expect. In fact, there's sample data here. So let's, so I've done that, node dot, okay, and it's telling me right now that the UI is available here. I can of course disable the UI if I don't want to have it, right? The server is up and running, and I call this, it's going to return me sample data, right? And it's going to return me sample data because in this case here, it auto-generated the sample data, put it into the controller, and said just do whatever you want, like change this with real data, right? So I will get rid of this, and of course, you know, I don't need to show you, but if I change this to be something else and I have all this complicated business logic, then I can pass it on to the consumer. So again, my job is to do nothing other than implement this function. It's telling me what I can expect in the args coming in, right? There's a search string that comes in. Here, just do this search string. It's telling me what's coming in. It tells me the data types that's coming in, right? Where did it go? It's on the search string, two-string perhaps. It's telling me what's coming in. And it's giving me the opportunity to add my logic into it, and it will take care of the rest. Does this make sense? As I return real data, then these examples go away. And you know, again, my job is to implement these things. I can pass on to my colleague to do the ingredients. I can work on the drinks. I can give somebody else the job to work on the orders. We could separate them into different files, or we could keep them all in one if we choose to.
Tony,
Yes.
so you're saying you change, if you implement business logic in here and change the Swagger file, it's not going to overwrite business logic?
In this one, no. If it does, then that's a bug. Yeah. So the reason why we split it into two different things here is that this class here is regenerated. This one, if it sees it, is not. Right? So we can blow over and regenerate the code if we want to. The other thing is, with this structure, I don't really need to regenerate ever, because the idea is I just update my spec, right? Sorry. I just update this and add whatever parameters I want, and then I can add the controller logic in here, and I'm done. Right? It's simply going to look for order drink based on the operation I gave it. Okay. So that's the. Is anyone trying this as we go? This whole thing is canned. This is a video. Okay. Okay, and so the last one here is, I will show you Java. Of course, the Java one's the best one because I wrote it. Actually, the Java one's the best example because Java is such a pain in the ass to write because there's so much you have to do. Listen, James Gosling was one of my advisors. Like, I love Java, but it is a lot of work. So. Let's look at the code before I run it, right? Okay, so first off, the same thing here's my Swagger definition, right? And in this case here, the code generator created the default controllers, right? And the controllers are expecting a couple of different things here. And it says right here, uncomment and implement as you see fit. If I do this, it's going to call it, right? This is not going to do much useful stuff. It's just going to return a 500, right? But it's the same thing, right? All I need to do is implement this and say what the entity is that comes back, and then it's done. Also, because this is Java, we don't deal with hashes necessarily as payloads in or response values out. It likes models. It likes concrete things, right? Like, for example, here I defined something called an ingredient. What would it be if there's no getter and setter and toString and hash code and all the stuff that we don't normally like to write, right? So the Java piece has a couple of additional functions. One is that the POM file, so the project file that comes down from when you download the source, has a profile in it where it will generate models for you. So let me run that. Maven package -p pojos. Right? And so what that's going to do is it's going to use the Swagger code generator. It's going to read my definition, and it just wrote these models. Right? So that's a lot of, I mean, yeah, IDEs are great, but they're great except when they're not. In this case here, I can keep changing this definition. I say, oops, I should give an example, drink properties or description. This is the unique identifier of the drink, right? And I can just say, look, just go regenerate the models, right? And it'll just keep doing it over and over, and it'll blow over the old ones. And they're in the gen folder, so you shouldn't change them anyway. We're going to change the drink object, right? So this is a lot of work normally. This thing is just doing it for me. If I run the server, it should run. It's now up. And we use Swagger UI. So I'll load Swagger UI from the file system. Right. There's my drinks API. This is a call to get drinks. And it's going to return sample data because I haven't implemented anything. In this case here, why don't I actually implement something? So this is the get drinks is right here. Get drinks. So I'm going to return drink. Drink dot set. What did I say that these things are? Set ID. And I'll do name. And I'll add it to the list. Right, Java. Can't do business logic for you. If we do, it would be super rich. Drink. No, I just think I can talk about.
You can change the status.
What's that?
You can change the status so it doesn't trigger 5 minutes.
Thank you. Here, I'll say, so I'll say 200. I think you can say status dot OK also. All right. So now it's going to hopefully return me one very special strong drink, right? So now I've gotten that out of the way, right? I've implemented one of these things. I can call the database, whatever I want to do. And again, like, what have I not done? Just on debug. I still have to implement this one. So let's just uncomment that.
Did your Swagger file specify a list, returning a list?
I think it did. Drinks. Get drink. So this was back to the other question, which was, are we lying here? Let's see. Drinks. Get drinks. No, it's returning a drink response.
You just return a drink.
I just returned a drink, so it should actually just slap my hand, right? Drink response. And drink response has a count and then a set of drinks in it. So thank you for keeping me honest. dr set values. Drink response has set values. So now I think we're telling the truth, in which case if it compiles.
They didn't flag it as an error.
Yeah, so this framework doesn't check the payload coming out. The node one will. And there's one other thing I want to show you along these lines in a second. So that's more like the structure that we would expect. And again, we know the payload, we know what's coming out, we know the schema because we defined it all here. So it should absolutely be checking and step by step here. Right? So it should just say, hey, it does not match.
Are there plans to add the validation?
Mhm. It's in a pull request, or if it's not, it's in a break fork right now. There's a lot of cool stuff you can do with this project because you can extend it for doing data type coercion and payload inspection and that sort of thing. Okay, so let me show you one last thing here, and then I want to pause. This thing uses a single configuration file, and there's lots of ways to tell it which file to use. But there's something in here which is in the README, which, like I said, no one ever reads. There's a thing called environment, EN, and the default is development. If I change this to production, right, this server will tell me that I'm a bad person because it says that there are unimplemented methods. And the worst thing that could happen with a definition-driven product is that somebody changes the definition and then you start returning stub data to them in production, right? And so this thing, because it knows what it needs to map to and what's there and what's not there, it also knows if something's not available. And in this case here, it's just going to blow up and say, there's just unimplemented methods, and you better fix them. So in the CI, my build process, I can set to staging where it will be nasty warn errors, or I can set to production where it will simply not start here. And it's telling me which one won't, it doesn't exist here. It says this particular function is not there, right? So there's a lot of things that it's trying to do to safeguard payload inspection inbound and outbound should be there as well. You could say, well, what about security? What about all that stuff? Well, security's hard, so we just punted on it. No, so we have the whole request object that comes in, and so juice or whatever it is that you need to use is implemented. You can add to this, so it'll do your security however you want. There's no one way to do it, so it's not baked into here saying you must implement the security mechanism. I believe that the Python version has full like OAuth, like tie-in to different providers. It's pretty clever. I didn't get that far in it, partially because it was over my head. So it's something to look into. Right. But now from the workflow point of view, I have this one place to work. I have one place to implement my code. I'll show you one other thing here that I think when we start thinking about how definitions become first class outside of just one repository, actually inside of a product, right? So in here I have my API here for that we're running off of. I can actually change, this has a API to get to this, which is here. I can actually change the URL for my project to point to that. And what that means is that, let me change this back to what that means is that now my definition for this API is centrally located. It lives on this product here, this Swagger Hub thing. Of course, it could be anywhere in your internal system. It could be GitHub raw. It could be in an enterprise GitHub, whatever. But now this whole notion of this API definition is right in the middle of the workflow and right in the middle of what your repository should be for software. I can prove that that's the case, but I know that you already trust me. It doesn't, oops, I have to say it. It doesn't auto restart because it can't listen to it, so I have to tell it to restart. Does that make sense? Right, so I can now start having this mechanism that's central in the org. I can share values across it. I can share values across all of my projects and reference back to the central location for models. So this drink response object doesn't necessarily need to be local to this document. It could be a resource that lives out on the web, for example. And so that the definition ties the server together. And that the mechanism is just a matter of controllers and small chunks of business logic, rather than this big thing that you need to deploy, 50 different dependencies and that sort of thing. Questions now? Yes.
So the code already generated. You add a lot of business logic here. Then how about modify the signature? Same question, how about add a new method?
Yeah, so if I modify the signature here, this is get drinks, where's get drinks? At the top. Get drinks. If I change the signature and I add another query param, right, save it. It won't find it. Right? It's just going to say like that method isn't there anymore, right? So it doesn't. This uses reflection to find the signature of the method that I'm going to call, and since it doesn't match anymore, this is no longer a valid signature. And so if I look at the debug mode output for it, see now I just got a new one here. Another param just showed up, right? And that's what you want, right? You don't want it to just silently ignore it and just be like, oh, okay, whatever. The designer added skip limit and filter, and then you as a developer didn't implement filter, but it still got called, and then somebody passes filter and it doesn't work, and then you get a phone call in the middle of the night. Here it'll just simply break. It'll say, I can't find a method, it's in production mode, can't start. Like, you gotta fix it. Yes?
I'm not familiar with how Swagger works with the version number, whether there is like a semantic versioning in there with regards to breaking changes and not, but have you considered being able to route to controllers based and have support multiple versions of the Swagger document simultaneously, so you can route to a 1.0 controller or a 1.1 controller?
Yeah. Versioning is hard. Versioning is like security. It's just hard, and you just punt on it, right? So versioning is hard. I have two preferred mechanisms for versioning, and then I'll answer your question. The first mechanism that I like is token based. So in situations where you have not a whole bunch of users, I mean it could be millions, right? But not anonymous accounts, where it'll say, this token is Tony's token. Tony is expecting version 1, and therefore route to version 1. In which case, some piece of logic in front of Swagger will say, it's Tony, send him to version 1. So think of that as a smart engine X module or HA proxy, whatever you want it to be, right? Some mechanism that routes you, right? The other mechanism is URL based, and if it's like super high volume and you just don't want to track every user and it's anonymous, it's like 90%, whatever. So having a URL that actually dictates your path here is the other mechanism. Okay, so this project itself will let you have many versions of a definition in it. So I can say there's a V1, there's a V2, V3, and it is my job then to say, well, I mean, we can point them all at one controller, and if it matches, then lucky us, right? I don't know if that's always good. I would probably say that it's best that the controllers are kind of follow the version. But this framework doesn't really care. I just say, look, does the signature match or not? And if it matches, and I say go here, then it'll go there and it'll call it. So the first one that I described with the tokens is not built in. This is the second one is. Yeah, versions is hard. We need hypermedia. Yes.
Question about Swagger Hub. If you flip back for a moment. So in the bottom left here, you've got your Swagger document, and it's in Swagger Hub right now.
Yep.
What you really want is to have that in source control, and not necessarily Swagger Hub. Is it a matter of, oh, that is exactly what I'm looking for?
Thank you.
Oh,
It's like on cue.
super sweet.
Yeah. So you put in the GitHub access token, and whenever you save, it'll just push it.
Cool.
There'll be a bunch of different integrations that come in here, but that should trigger lots of things. So I was going to set it up, but I didn't pull it off for today. But I can then trigger. So when I push that, it triggers Travis. Travis will see if the methods match or don't based on the environment that I put in. I say it's a production environment. And then it blows up and says, oh, you broke the signature, it's not going to work. Now I can trust that the documentation person can make changes here, and I'm not worried that they're going to bust my API, right? Because Travis is going to catch me, right? Not that they ever will. But we're giving a lot of power to them. We're saying, like, modify the source of truth for my whole system, right? And so you want to have something that can catch changes that cause problems. If I spelled drinks wrong here, and you fix it, it's going to break my API, right? Let's show one other thing here, unless there's another question about these three guys here. So one of the things that's really saves people a lot of time is this button right here. And so being able to download a client that can connect to that API, that is built for that API, without writing it by hand. I don't know why I keep choosing Python, because I'm just so bad at Python. it just wrote the whole client SDK, right? And it tells me how to do it. You know, it says, look, you need to import Swagger client like this, and then there's a main function. You can give it the base path here and put it in, and then call it whatever the functions are. You're going to get back the data which corresponds to the schema of the thing that you're expecting. And when you start working in like a microservices environment where you've got the server definition like this, and you've got a Java consumer, and you're just making lots of SDKs, and you're changing this a lot, you will never be able to keep up with client SDKs, and you have to use something else, right? And so this is one way that's clever, and it's pretty quick to integrate. The client SDK generation, it is called a code generator. It's the same thing that's used for clients and servers. Like if you don't know any Qt C++, right, then this can get you to the point where you have a Qt C++ client library. The other thing is the generators use, I'll show you what that looks like. It's all, again, everything they've shown with the exception of Swagger Hub is completely open source. The online code generator lives here, the same source that runs on the Swagger IO domain. There's a Swagger UI on this that you can try out. I think it's kind of cool to see how it works. In this here, it shows the different clients that I can create. And if I say I want to generate, I won't choose Python this time. If I want to create a Objective-C client, there are different, let's see, let me do that. There are different options, right? So, like for example, if it's Java, there's packages. If it's Objective-C, class prefix, right? So in the case here, the API tells you how to call the code generator, which is kind of meta, but it works if you think about it. It tells us here that there's an option where I can pass class prefix, and it's going to default to use SWG in front of all of the models that it creates, right? Because Apple wants you to do everything their way, and they say they want 3 capital letters in front of every class. So I can override it, say HN for Hacker News. I say the pod file, the version, all this stuff, author name. It will dump it into the templates. It'll process it, and when I download the client SDK, which I will do, Objective-C here. Why don't I do it for my API that I just made? Right here are the options I have to give it. I'm giving it the URL. I have no security definition because security is hard. No, honestly, I mean it when I say that. But you can tell it, like, use an API key, use basic auth, whatever you want, and it'll do it. Whatever you want around security definitions, it'll do it. It won't do everything you want. And then when I run this, with any luck, it's taking a long time. Did I bust it? Now I see, just because I tried something different, it's going to not work. Or let's take another question while we're watching the spinner. Yes.
Do you have an opinion with regards to generating clients as to whether it's the job of the API provider to generate all the clients and allow consumers to download them, or whether you just tell the API consumer, go generate your own client?
Yeah, I can see the value of both. I kind of think as a producer of API, you're better off generating it for them and just saying, here it is. Because you don't want them to, they put in some weird option, or the generator's down, or whatever it is, right? That pisses me off. Hang on a second. You don't want them to do something weird. Oh, I lost my internet connection. Okay. You don't want them to do something weird and breaks it and you get a support call. So I kind of think it's best to generate them, have them available, sanity check, write a couple tests even, right? Go figure. I didn't say testing is hard, I said security is hard, right? So write some tests against it. You can use the code generation to help with them. Yeah, I lost my connection. Either that or somebody took out the whole online generator.
Is Inflector a good tool to use if you have an existing API and you're trying to start with?
That is a good question. So it depends how your existing API is written. And there's some janky APIs written out there, and I've done it too, right? And so, so the reason why I say that is some of them will just be too hard to retrofit something like that. You know? Okay, so now it's working. Okay, so in any case, so the difference is if the API is written such that the business logic is really abstracted away from the rest here, then yeah, it's easy, right? You call it, it's just literally it's a function, and while some people can't write APIs and there's lots of them, most people can write functions, and so if you can put that business logic in, then it works. Okay, so that was a generator. It actually came back that time. This is what the response looks like, and it gives me a link to download it, right? And if I do that, then I have my client. Right? And I showed you before, I was trying to download my drink API, and this is the pet store. I'll try the drink API. What other questions can I answer about this? I think it's pretty cool. I've written a lot of boilerplate code, and like I said, anything I can do to not jump right in boilerplate code, it just makes me smile.
Are there any ramifications of using Inflector in production as far as performance?
It should have zero implications, because what it does is on startup, it caches all the methods, and it caches the classes. It doesn't cache the classes. It uses a factory to generate the classes, in which case you can say create a new one or cache them, right? So it uses the same framework as JAX RS. It just programmatically creates the routes that you have limitations. So it should have zero. If somebody does a benchmark and says I'm wrong, I would love to see it, because I don't think it makes a single bit of difference. It's used in production in several places, very high traffic, and we moved it from pure JAX RS to that, and there was a difference. I was hoping to make it faster, but it didn't make it slow. Other questions? My drinks API, so it showed it actually wasn't servers. Yes?
You're trading off the JSON format for the language binding that maps to, and that you get the benefits of the language, but you lose the flexibility of JSON, right?
In what sense?
Well, the signature could have carried, rather than create that mapping that you created, could have carried the JSON payload into the function. And then when you did the
Yes.
modification, you wouldn't have had a new
Yep.
method. And
So great question. Are you speaking about client generation, or are you talking about the server?
server.
Okay, so there's a couple of different things. So first off, in this example here, it is very concrete. So when I order a drink, where's order drink? Right here. You see that from back there? You have good eyes. This here, this doesn't really have a real payload. If I change this to use something like a complex class as an input, right? As opposed, so if I say that there's a user object coming in, there's many fields inside of it. These are all primitives, and it makes it look like I was cheating. I wasn't cheating. It just happened that that's what drink APIs are simple, I guess. If I had a complex body being put in, I can tell this thing to take a JSON object, which is part of the Jackson framework. In which case you can send in anything. It's got a hash, it's got a map inside it, it's got a list, an array, whatever. And it will take it in. So I actually don't even need to generate a POJO inside here. So it'll take that hash in. But you're correct in what it doesn't do is say, here's a concrete object, and there might be other attributes inside of it, right? So the person, I might declare here that drink has these 3 properties, when in reality there's is hidden. It doesn't say like it'll also have arbitrary things inside it.
Can't you write a validator for that?
Yeah, so there's two things you can do. One is I can say, look, this is an internal thing, X hidden. That'll hide it in the definition, right? Which means that when I generate the code or show the definition, it actually won't appear there. Now doesn't make a lot of sense for this use case, what I just described, so I don't know why I showed you that, but I did. So the idea here is that like there can be things internally that I'm not going to use. Now I can create a filter very simply that says don't show hidden things unless it's my API key or that passes some headers or something like that. In which case then I can generate the code, I can include ID, right? But the rest of the world isn't going to see it. So there might be some hidden parameters we send back and forth. The other thing that you could do to handle specifically the case of saying, I want to have an object that has these concrete fields in it, because that's what I want the consumers to see. But I also want it to have all this other stuff that might get passed in. Then I would just say create an object that extends map and then also have concrete setters and getters for these types of fields. So it could basically be ID, name, calories, and other data, right? So that's up to you in the generation and the mapping between the model and what it thinks it should be, what the schema is. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but I thought you could add, I guess they're called converters.
Mm-hmm.
You could do more elaborate validation with
Yep.
a converter.
So in that case, what you would do is you would generate the object itself on your own, and then there's an extension that says xSwagger, and this is all in the documentation that no one reads. Model my complex model, where it's going to say, yep, here's the schema, here's the definition, but when it calls this server, look for my complex model, and it will map it to that. And so all the magic that happens when it gets the payload and it turns into this object will be done against that. And then that can have whatever the heck you want inside it as far as transformations and that sort of stuff.
That's for the model.
That's for the model, yeah. So it could be some complicated thing that goes in the database, like who knows, it could be whatever. Yes?
So Swagger is becoming the first class citizen for describing the HTTP API, and now we're automating routing using it. How far do you see taking this with regards to describing an HTTP API? Can I put freshness information for caching, like how long this resource could be cached for? Can I declare this should have an E tag or last modified?
Mm-hmm. So lots of things. So you asked a lot of questions. So I'm going to pick the easiest one. Okay. That's what politicians do. No, let me just speak to first where I think this stuff goes. Okay, think of, this sounds super philosophical, but think of like 15 years ago, right? We have buy servers, and then you rent servers, you go to Rackspace, and then you get Amazon instances, and you launch servers, now you launch containers, now there's things like Lambda that do all this crap, and all you do is this, right? And so I think that that's the limit, is that business logic is all that you have to do, right? And so what happens between the consumer and business logic is just busy, right? And there will be very, very good solutions to this. I know Microsoft is making them, I know Amazon makes them. So this is just taking the idea of the API as plumbing a step further, right? Now, there are other things that have to happen, right? Like freshness, E-tag, security, cache policy, all that sort of thing. And the answer to that in this framework is that this is just a library that programmatically creates routes. You do the same thing that you would do if you were manually creating the routes or using annotations. You add a servlet filter, you do whatever it was that you used to do before. This is just another application inside the standard framework. So I can add whatever I want on top of it, this thing doesn't know. That's the difference between this being a whole framework and just kind of a routing layer, right? So we don't want to say we've got to support everything. We say, look, there's a whole community that makes this stuff, and they did a really good job. Let's just take the hard part, or not the hard part, the mundane part about making routes, and do that automatically and use the Swagger spec as the source of truth. And then do your e-tag stuff, you do everything else the way you did it before. This makes no difference. The same thing with the Flask version, which is just, it's just doing that one specific thing, which is routing requests to controllers. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay. Let's see. What else should I show you? What other questions are there? I wish there were real drinks. I wish that this drink order actually worked.
What about, I guess this is inflector specific, but Hateos support in Swagger.
That's just hard also.
Yeah.
So a couple of answers to that. First off, there's a pluggable framework for entity processors, both in and outbound. And there's a pretty, I don't have the project open. There's a pretty simple interface to add. There's three things that are first class in here meant for development. Validation. So validation is saying, here's an input, here's the value that you're expecting, the schema that you're expecting, right? Here's all this stuff that we know. Is this thing okay or not? In which case you have the chance to say, I know that might fit a social credit card signature. They're simple checksums, right, against credit card. You can just say that's not a valid credit card, and it'll never hit your business logic. Okay, so that's a validator. A converter would simply say, here is, because it's coming in, for example, over a string, for anything except a body, here is the input. It's the string yes. Here's the schema. It says it's a Boolean, right? Yes is not a Boolean true, right? You can say that it is, in which case you can say this is a Boolean true, right? And then the last thing is that entity processors would just say, here's a payload coming in. It's not a primitive. Here's your schema. You convert it into the object, and it wants it to be this thing. So if it's protobuf or whatever it ends up being, right? If you can figure out how to convert it, then it'll just pass to the controller and no one cares, right? So it could be going over a WebSocket, right? The WebSocket could sit in front of this thing, it's gonna call that controller and say, look, we just wrote this WebSocket processor and it's gonna get this binary data and turn it into a POJO and then we're done. So those are the three things that are built into this to be extended. About other types of formats, I would say, any registration for media types and content types, you can write a processor to do. So that would be my answer to AWS.
You just write the processor and then add it to the
Yeah,
list.
you add it in here with com.myProcessor.
So you said there's an existing one for validation?
Yeah,
So
all right,
what would that look like?
I'll show you. This is where I give up on the Sublime thing. I just can't. Let's see. All right, so there is. Okay, processors. So there's a JSON provider. So that would be your JSON processor. The entity processor looks like that. Very simple, right? Media type, input stream, class it wants it to turn into. Can you do it, right? Let's see, a converter looks like this, where it gets like I said, it's going to be a string coming in. It's always a list of strings, and it is my job then to say, here's the parameter, I know the schema, and I know what they want me to turn it into. Can I do it? Right? In this case here, it's converting it's converting like comma separated, right? There's no standard for sending multiple values across a query parameter, so we've got to support a different structure. CSV or pipes or space or multi, meaning it's the same parameter name defined many times. This will do the converter casting, right? It'll say If it's expecting it to be a string, it's going to return it. If it's an integer, it's going to return it. If it tries and it fails, see here we support 1 for Boolean to be true and 0 for false. So you can write your own for this. Converter is very simple. And then a validator. Did I already say validator? Right. So here it will look at, for example, part of Swagger says if it's a number, right? This is a numeric validator, and this is a chain of them. If it's a number, I can define a range, right? And here I say if it's over the maximum, well, don't let it get to my controller. Let's just return a 400 error. In this case here, it will automatically catch it, make a list of all of them, and then throw the error back.
So you would implement the validator interface and then just add that to the entity processor?
Yep, that's it. And it does it, it's an array, so it doesn't in order, so if there's something that has to happen before anything else. So we made a converter, for example, we had a Java guy that thought that all enums should be all shout case, right? And then the front end guy's like, dude, why are you shout casing all the enums? Like, I want to put lowercase. So we wrote a converter that says, you know, if it matches and case insensitive, then fix it and pass it on. So you can kind of coerce values through the chain into the vernacular that the server wants. In that case, shout case is common. Yes.
Can you speak to the roadmap for Swagger Hub maybe? I mean, for instance, a discussion forum, I'm not sure, the last time I looked there wasn't one.
Yep, there's this discussion forum on SmartBear's site. So if you go to smartbear.com, then go to Swagger Hub, there's a forum on it. I'll talk about, since I have a few minutes, I'll talk about the roadmap for that and also for the shirt that I'm wearing. So first off, Swagger Hub is release of version 1 the end of September. There's, I think, 1,800 APIs that are in that now. You'll see private APIs capabilities coming up soon, integrations with other tools, tighter workflow integration. So like GitHub push, that's one of many different types of integrations when we have workflow. So we want to be that it becomes the canonical source of information for versions of APIs, right? That you can always get back to them, right? And the canonical version of the API. So you might have 15 versions, and this is the one that you should use if you come in cold, right? So a lot of things that you'll see about that. There's a Twitter handle, but there's forums where people ask questions. The shirt that I'm wearing, I just got today. So Swagger 2 weeks ago announced, we joined a Linux Foundation where the specification behind Swagger, so the JSON that you saw, the YAML that you saw, the thing that makes all of the tooling work is going into an open governance, right? And that sounds heavy and thick, but it's actually very important and a very big deal for Swagger and for hopefully for the whole community. So with Microsoft, IBM, Google, Freescale, Restlib, a bunch of PayPal, Capital, I know I'm going to offend somebody if I don't name everybody. PayPal, Intuit, who am I missing? Moshape just joined. So big API visionaries, people who care a lot about APIs, have joined this thing. SmartBear, of course. I didn't say that, Paul. You should have wanted. I know. Don't tell my boss. We're moving the spec into that so that a group will be responsible for promoting the spec, the direction of what it supports, right? Making sure it's more compatible with more tooling, and it gives a better opportunity for these big companies to invest in the infrastructure. So imagine the scenario which was a year ago, you know, Tony's got Swagger API, GitHub board, and then Tony gets hit by a car or gets killed by somebody that doesn't like me. And then it's like, what happened to this project, right? So now the spec is in this mechanism where anyone can see what the roadmap is, anyone can contribute technically to what it wants, what they want it to do, and then companies can join formally to say, we want the spec to move in this direction, and we want to do X, Y, and Z, right? So it is now in the Linux Foundation. It's a really big deal for it because we're trying to make it not just the de facto way to describe APIs, we want it to be the way to describe APIs. And more services that are available for people to consume them, and the ability to switch between them transparently. Right? If I'm on API management X and I switch to this one, and it doesn't change like a lot of things about my tooling, it's just going to make everyone make better products, right? So the hope is to make it so that consuming APIs will be as simple as, using a browser and going to the web. Right? Remember when you had to use certain browsers to go to certain websites, right? So now the goal is to say, let's just make it standard, let's just make it open and constant, so that that you can use this tooling set across any API. So that'll be a big deal. You'll see a lot of things coming from that, and people can participate and join in. There's a technical contributor mechanism where anyone can contribute to the specification now, where previously it was kind of this dictatorship where there was a small number of people who made decisions. Does that make sense? OpenAPIs.org is the domain. And Microsoft is a member. They're not listed on there. That's a side joke I'll cover offline. It's kind of funny. Okay. Anything else at 8 minutes? Yes.
Hi. So there's a lot of companies that have invested heavily in Swagger already, and they might be stuck on version 1.2, and it's great. I can see all the things that I can do. What support do you think you can realistically provide for aiding people to migrate onto Swagger 2 so they can really start? I know it's going to be hard to retrofit some stuff in, but for example, I think we've probably got something like 50 APIs, which isn't massive, but equally we've invested enough.
Yep.
And the products out using them and changing it just for the Swagger.
Yeah.
So there's a hard sell.
Good question. So let me talk first about the status of the two. Actually, there's 4 specs. Swagger started with 1.0 in 2011, and then every year we've released a version. Swagger 2 by downloads is about 10,000 per day out of 15,000 of our tools, right? So it's more than, well more than half of the total downloads. The philosophy has always been that the tooling should do its very, very best, pinky promise, very bestest, to support one version back. So the code generation, for example, so it's very best, it doesn't say it can always do it. So the code generator, I believe, can go all the way back to version 1. There are edge cases always that don't always work, right? So we've tried to make it so you can use Swagger UI with version 2, you can use it with version 1.2, in many cases in version 1.1, and we went through great pains in the code generation, for example, to get around some of the ambiguities in the 1.2 spec. So if I could go back in time when we released 1.2, we would have made a schema and made it obvious, right? The problem is a bunch of tools got built up for making invalid Swagger, and it wasn't obvious, but the UI worked, and so they said, oh, this is great, let's make 49 more APIs, right? And so because of that, now there's a schema, and so we go through great pains to say, okay, here's a standard library pattern that we saw from version 1.2 that doesn't translate correctly to 2.0, or it's not even valid 1.2, to write parsers and write validators to migrate that. So the code generation and the UI internally convert everything to version 2. Right? So going from version 2 to what will probably be version 3 will be much, much easier, but we will support one version back in the tooling form. And go through, again, like all the pains in the process, but it's hard on the community if you just say, look, you can't use this, right? There'll be some things that you can't use with a 2.0 spec when there's a 3.0. Probably, I don't know of any yet, but there's a good chance. Compatibility sucks. That's the other hard thing. So we just punt on it. Okay, anything else? All right, well, please try it out. Try the servers, file bugs if you find them. And that's it. Thanks, everyone.